I'm sitting inside a 2007 BMW M Coupe, supplied to me by one of our viewers. Now, whether you're a BMW fan or not, you probably understand there is a rabid following for some of the previous generation cars. Whether it's a mechanical connection, styling, that's something we're going to explore in this video, so let's get started. Rewind 20 years ago, and the automotive landscape has changed drastically thanks to customer demand, global economies, emission standards, and safety requirements that all of these companies have to follow. In the case of BMW, it was a much different brand than it is today. When you look at the inside of the M Coupe, you can clearly tell this was an enthusiast-focused product. And what does that mean? Well, for one, there was less confusion inside of BMW about what made for a driver-centric interior space. Take, for example, the gauge cluster. It's an analog speedometer and tachometer that dims down to the point you don't even notice it at night. The LCD that's there, that just tells you your time, your outside temperature. You don't have to be reading about how much torque the engine's making, what your lateral acceleration is, things that you don't even care about if you're connected with the car and want to enjoy the drive. There are no gimmicks on the inside here, although this was the tipping point for technology. In this generation, we saw the introduction to drive mode selection. However, there's not 5, 6, or 7 modes. There's one, sport mode, and all it did was change the throttle mapping or sensitivity. Additionally, this is the dawn of infotainment. In the case of BMW, they were on the cutting edge, and the way they implemented this here is to build it into the top of the dashboard in a flip-up motorized screen. And thank God you can put it down and never look at it. Because when Jack and I always harp on new cars about making screens or technology the center point of a car, you can see exactly what happens when you look at it 15, 20 years removed. This dates a vehicle more than anything else. When you look at the menu structure, the overall resolution, the graphical display, it's so bad. And thank God, again, you can put it down and focus on the highlights of what this is. Low glare materials, durable leather and plastics, a cockpit that surrounds you with a focused feeling. Everything is super easy to use and get to without having to over-interact with everything. The seats are purposeful and comfortable. The pedal box is well laid out for manual transmission driving. Yes, there's not 10 gears here, there's 6, and you have to shift it yourself. The cargo area is pretty useful. Having a hatchback makes this a much more practical, everyday sports car. And the main thing to talk about here is this doesn't feel like a recycled entry-level luxury car. People ask me, well, why not the E92? Why didn't you like the E92? Well, it doesn't feel special. You have one of the best motors ever created in a car that feels like a standard 3 Series. I never felt like I was in a sports car in some of those generations of vehicles. This feels like it was purpose-built to be driven. And that's what I like from a dedicated enthusiast car, something that has disappeared every single year since then. Let's take a look at this in the shop and talk about the technical details. Underneath the BMW Z4 M Coupe, I'm here with Jack BMW, who is going to sprinkle all the technical information all over me. What do we got?
So this is a extremely rare M product. They built less than 1,800 M Coupes. In fact, this is one of the few M products ever built in the United States. The original Z3 clown shoe was as well. And this is one of the last cars. In fact, this is the last car with the S54, making this the last M product with a dipstick.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. That's got me hooked already. So what's the big difference between, because there was a Z4, the convertible, and what's the difference between this and that?
The torsional rigidity. This is nearly twice as rigid as the convertible, and that's because of the magnesium framed roof. In fact, this is one of the most rigid BMW M products from the Bengal era. It is an extremely impressive car in that regards. From what I understand from the stories I read, they did very little chassis changes to their motorsports program for the Z4 race cars. If you look at this compared to a regular Z4 though, you'll notice that this has hydraulic power steering versus EPS. And you have a wider track by 0.5 inches and a different lower control arm design. These are M-specific control arms. Both of them are aluminum, meaning the regular Z4 had aluminum lower control arms, but these are lighter and more rigid.
Okay. And the rest of the car, given its price point at the time, this wasn't trying to compete with like the Z8 or like...
This was 50 grand.
50 grand. So you don't see heavy use of aluminum. It's pretty much all cast or stamped steel parts, with the exception of these guys and the hood. But there are other little touches here. You still have a skid plate because the engine is pretty low. The center of gravity is low here. A lot of traditional BMW things you see. There are brake ducts. There are channels to flow air. There are ductwork. Well, there's a duct in the skid plate to help cool the transmission. And then, of course, there's minimal use of plastic covers on this car compared to the modern BMWs. But I think from the front end perspective, the only other thing you're going to notice is there's an oil cooler to help cool the engine when you're just revving this thing out incessantly. But let's head to the back and take a look at the rear differential and suspension.
All right. We made it to the rear, and you're going to notice a couple special tidbits found on the M variants of this car. You have an entirely different rear subframe, and that's because of the M differential. This diff was originally found on the E46 M3, and then it made it into the M5 from this era and the M6. This M diff is a clutch pack style diff, which BMW developed with GKN. You'll also notice a unique trans. It is the only time the ZF Type H gearbox was used in a M product, and BMW claims it has lifetime fill.
A lifetime oil fill?
Yes, which is a very bad idea.
Okay, yeah, don't do that. Yeah, so anyway, in the back, you know, there are a few things to look at. You do have an aluminum upper control arm here, and I know we talked about there's minimal use of that up front, but everything else, again, is stamped steel or cast steel. You do have some interesting parts. You have these aluminum covers that also feature a NACA duct or two NACA ducts that flow over the differential. And there are some cooling fins or cooling pathways through the differential that flow air smoothly out the back that integrate with the muffler design. It's essentially, you know, a half diffuser.
You find that in a lot of M cars. The other thing to bring up with the exhaust is because of the emissions regulations, this being the last S54 car, there are 4 catalytic converters.
Oh my God. So you could probably gain a ton of power by stripping them off if you were going to do track driving and all that. It's a very interesting design car. There's a lot of work that went into this, and given the time period, you start to see how much work they did into this and how it's evolved as we look at the newer M products. But aside from that, Jack, let's take a look at the engine, since that's one of the most exciting parts about this car.
All right.
Under the hood of the M Coupe, this is a very nice looking engine. What do we have?
This is the S54. In fact, this is, in my opinion, one of the greatest motors BMW ever produced.
You're not kidding. This is one of the few engines, as a younger person, like in my 20s, I was so excited to drive a car with this motor in there, because it was like all the technology, the horsepower was there. Again, this is like pinnacle BMW stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, when I think BMW, why my name is secretly John BMW, is this era of drivetrain, right? The S54 is amazing. It revs to 7,900 RPM. It's an iron block with aluminum heads. It has ITBs, it means independent throttle bodies. You have special lifters that are lighter weight than a regular style lifter that you found in other BMWs. You have its own like oiling pump for the Van House system, unlike regular BMWs. It's really special. makes 330 horsepower in the US market, makes mid-low 200s in torque. I mean, it's...
So tell me a little bit about where this car came from, because the owner bought this through a specialty dealership.
Yeah, it came from EAG, and if you're a BMW fanatic, you might have heard of this dealership. Eric is one of the owners, and he was nice enough to spend about an hour with me discussing really the reliability problems with the S54. And because this is the last car to get this engine, it got all the running updates and changes, and most importantly, the rod bearing issues were solved. So earlier E46 M3s, 02, 03, and then the beginning, all had issues much like the E92. Because they did a bearing cap design change on basically the end of the 03 production run of the S54, this motor in this car does not have that issue.
Yeah, and that's an important part about buying something like this. You had, in hindsight, clearly you understand all the manufacturing problems that they had and the changes they make throughout a life cycle that maybe at the time you don't know, but now we see the certain years that are okay to get because of these modifications. However, this motor might, like many of the BMWs of this era, ran a 10W60 oil. And this is also a part of the argument about some of the motors eating themselves. You have a ultra thick oil, and it's not something that you want to race the engine with until there's a ton of temperature. And we drove this, and it took me 17 minutes before the oil temperature was up to about 210. And for that oil, that's like the sweet spot where you just can start getting on it. So a lot of people don't understand that. Again, it's another thing about having a car like this. It's not just like a Honda Civic engine. You know, it does feel special, it does sound special, and it requires a little bit more care, which you were going to tell me about.
Yeah, so this, much like the AP1 S2000, has solid lifters, which mean every 30,000 miles you have to manually adjust them. It's about $900 at least at EAG, but that's unfortunately the cost of doing business with a car like this. I'm not trying to scare away future owners, but there are some compromises you have to make with a really high revving, naturally aspirated engine.
This isn't like E92 stuff where you look at the engine bay itself, as you've seen some of the B-roll, there is some space to work around in here as well. It's not, you know, once you take the airbox part off, that right side of the engine is pretty clear. There's room to breathe. And I think because everything's been figured out, there's a lot of people that know how to work on these. This isn't as scary as a proposition.
It's like the V10 M5 or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the reliability also seems to be there. So you talked about the water pumps, you know, notorious water pump issues with BMW. It's electronic water pump. It has issues with the plastic gears. However, this doesn't have the issue with the electronic throttle body actuator like the E92 or the V10 has.
The only real notorious issue with S54 is that carried on to the very end is double Vanos. So double Vanos is BMW's variable valve timing. It's both on the intake and exhaust side. However, with age, specifically a lot of the plastic components start to fail. So there are kits out there that will help you basically replace the system or fix the wear items, but it's something to keep basically in mind. This isn't the ticking time bomb a lot of the other M cars are, but you should definitely set aside some money.
I'm really excited to drive this. Let's get this on the road and see how it operates. Setting off in the M Coupe, Jack. Ooh, listen to that engine, wow.
Yeah, it's safe to say that you and I are not the biggest fans of the more recent M cars or BMWs for that matter. Definitely you more so than me, but I'm happy that I finally gotten you into the golden era of BMWs. This is an S54 car, it's a manual, and it's everything I want in a BMW.
So tell me a little bit about the price of this, because the owner got a pristine example, and how much was he into it for?
$36,000.
Okay. So when we talk about the era of modern sports cars, everybody constantly complains how expensive everything is. Everything's watered down, a lot by necessity, which I talked about that a bit on the interior. And for me, I love driving. I really do. I'm super passionate about it, and I'm waiting for something to reconnect me with that experience again. And sadly, you know, you have to go back a little bit farther now to feel this type of mechanical connection.
An analog car, which this is. You have hydraulic steering, a manual trans, very little nannies that you can turn all off with one button, and it feels connected to the road. And I know that's a cliche that everyone says, but this really is a very analog feeling car.
It is about as much as analog you can feel on a BMW. So let's get into the driving character of this. The steering is a highlight. It is not numb. There is weight to it. You feel what the front end is doing. When you hit a bump or a ridge or a crease in the pavement, you feel the weight in the steering wheel change. You feel some type of vibration. The steering is not over hyperactive where you turn the wheel and it's like snapping all over the place. When you're in normal throttle mode, not in sport mode, the throttle is very progressive and the engine winds up very quick just by the nature of this. It has that, I don't want to say race motor feel, but it's as close to kind of like that race car motor throttle response that you can get from a street car, at least from a BMW perspective.
This engine is, to me, it kind of reminds me of an S2000 with horsepower and a little bit of torque.
Yeah, and that's true. It has the classic BMW sound to it when you wind it out. So I'm going to go down a couple gears. The party doesn't get started until after 5,500 RPMs. Now, it's not like VTEC. You know, the double Vanos system is basically seamless. It just builds power smoothly, and it's all at the top end, and you have to wind this motor out to really appreciate it. But once you stay there and you keep going through the gears, the sound is no longer existent in newer cars until you get into like the Porsche motors.
It's this great mechanical induction that only exists in naturally aspirated cars. Really from this era, because of emissions and regulations, you'll not see another motor like the S54 in an NA capacity.
Well, not from BMW at least. So, you know, when you're driving this, I was a little caught off guard by that, but so that's the other part of this, is there's this sense to it that you can still get it out of control. And that's what I like about it. You know, every time I get into a modern BMW, the first thing that comes over me is I'm in the back seat driving. I'm not at the forefront. Every single input is filtered by some type of computer control system, electronic brake force distribution. The steering is altered through variable gear ratio steering. If you don't have a manual transmission, if you have an automatic, all of that is electronically controlled. Everything is filtered. And here, yes, they've refined the edges. This is still BMW.
A BMW, a $50,000 car when it was new.
Right. So this is not the most raw experience, but it's one of the most balanced that BMW has ever done, between trying to find a real connection with the driver where I get out and I feel something in my stomach. I feel something here. I feel a connection to the machine. That's what I'm longing for, that I get a piece of that here. And when I take this out, like today, I'm under a ton of stress. When I get out, I can lose myself in the experience and not feel like I want to get out of here right away, because it doesn't beat me up. It's noisy, but it's not so noisy that I get fatigued by it. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of cars.
This is a car you could drive every single day, have a good time in. It doesn't make a tremendous amount of power, so you can still wind it out on the street. But I guess let's talk about some of the more specific dynamics of this car when it comes to suspension tuning. Something I've noticed when I've driven a little bit harder, it's not a car that necessarily rewards ham-fisted driving, if you know what I mean.
It doesn't. So it goes into, we talked about this, it goes into kind of a push or an understeer under braking. So you got to get the front unsettled. It'll wash out a little bit, and then you have to correct it with throttle. But it's not something that takes a lot of time to get adjusted to.
No, and unlike a lot of the newer BMWs with having force induction, when you break it loose, it's because you've upset the suspension. Yes. It's not the torque of the turbocharged engine throwing the car sideways.
I just got out of your Vet, which is naturally aspirated, and one of the things that really annoys me about that car is if I'm turning the wheel and I'm in any type of just any minute turn and you're on the throttle, there's so much torque that back end just wants to walk all over the place. This, if you're in the right gear and you're under throttle, you can progressively get the throttle up where you have to wind it out more to stabilize the rear end in normal driving, or do something really stupid. So it's a lot easier to drive this fast than a lot of these higher horsepower cars that just let's lose the back end, let's lose the back end. That's not what this is about.
The one thing to bring up about when the car does snap on you, because of how stiff the suspension is mixed with the chassis tuning, the car has a tendency to snap back when you are catching it.
It does, and I noticed that when we pulled out and I kind of got on the throttle, it wants to kind of walk, and then if you correct it, it kind of snaps back quickly. It will catch you off guard, but again, that's some of the driving character here. Not everything is completely predictable, A to Z. It's just more engaging to drive. Is it the best car? No. And I think even the owner of this car said this is a feeder for him to get into something better.
Like a 911,
like
is what he wants.
Right. That's what he wants. He wants a higher horsepower, like more refined machine. But at $36,000, there's not a whole hell of a lot that I've been in recent memory that compares to the balanced approach favoring the more driver-centric approach that this car does.
It's really impressive.
The only negatives, let's get into that. We've talked a lot about the driving experience of this car. The negatives are, like most BMWs, the manual transmission, at least the lever, feels like you're shifting a piece of plastic.
The linkage itself does feel like a toy, but the throws are very precise and they're not particularly long. But the lever, the whole assembly feels like it's plastic on plastic.
Yeah, well, like you said, the shifts are great. The throws, the actual actuation, getting from gear to gear is short, but just the shift lever, it reminds me a lot of like the E92. It just feels flexible. It's like there's either rubber or plastic bending in there. It's a manual trans, and I'll take that in this era, but it's not the best feeling manual transmission. The pedal box, when you really start to drive this, you have to be careful with the size shoe you wear, or if your shoe has too much shoulder on the side for support, because the side of my foot's constantly rubbing on the carpet down here. But again, this is a very focused cockpit. It's a very focused driving experience for somebody that really does appreciate and values driving over everything else. And with that said, Jack, let's get into the final thoughts.
All right.
Final thoughts on the M Coupe. And to my surprise, I really enjoyed driving this, in large part because I've been so disappointed by some of the modern iterations of BMW sports cars. So let's discuss the pros and cons. The cons are this. There is a little bit, this is right on that cusp of being a bit too refined. They've stripped out some of the rawness of one of the greatest BMW engines I've ever experienced. I feel like there's not enough induction noise and not enough exhaust noise to let you really feel it. The counterpoint is there's still a little bit of vibration. There's just enough there where it's not annoying. And I think some of this can be tweaked with minor aftermarket stuff, to be completely fair. But the pros of it, this is a great riding car that you could deal with every day. It's not that sports car where you think, well, it's too hot out, it's too cold out, it's uncomfortable, I don't want to deal with this. There are very few compromises other than the fact that it's only 2 seats. You still have a usable hatch space. I mean, I can see why so many people would want this, but sadly, there's not a lot of clean examples out there. The owner bought this for a remarkable $36,000. And when you look at what you're getting, a manual transmission, limited slip differential, a purpose-built platform for a sports car, it doesn't feel like a 3 Series tarted up to be a sports car. It doesn't feel like a 2 Series trying to be a sports car. It's just a sports car, much like the new Supra and the Z4 that sit behind it. That is the closest modern successor to this BMW that I can pretty much think of. Now, this is still in the days of having a naturally aspirated motor. It's still in the days of having a decent manual transmission. And it was still in the days where you could see clear focus to being a very clearly designed, fun to drive product. And that is why I like it. You have an emotional connection when you operate it. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.